Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Welcome to another edition of Illinois Rising. I'm Dan Proft, morning drive host on Chicago's Morning Answer, along with Amy Jacobson, Monday to Friday, 5 to 9 a.m. on AM 560. And with me is Pat Hughes, the co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project. And Pat, we're on the cusp of having the General Assembly deal with the governor's amendatory veto now that they're returning from have returned from their junket to see State Senator Toy Hutchison coronated as the incoming chairman of the National Council of State Legislatures. So they had a little 10-day interregnum there while they took care of attending to their honorifics. And then we just sat here and waited, Illinois families, to find out if schools are going to open on time, if funding is going to be cut, if funding is going to be increased, what the nature of the school year is going to look like, and the state's part in it. And so we're looking at the question of impact of the governor's amendatory veto of what the Democrat-controlled General Assembly sent him. But one thing that hasn't been discussed, because both parties start from the same premise, and that's sort of been the problem in Illinois on a range of issues for as long as I've been alive. Republicans start from the big government premise of the left and ultimately come to the big government premises inescapable conclusions or some facsimile of them. And so is the case with evidence-based school funding model. You just had late this week Senate Republicans defending the governor's amendatory veto, saying it does not undercut the evidence-based model for school funding. No one other than us is questioning the premise of whether or not evidence-based model for school funding is a good thing.
Yeah, it's a giant political problem, Dan. It's why Republicans in the state lose arguments. It's why the governor is right now in a bad spot on this amendatory veto, which I expect is going to be overturned. But that's the biggest problem, right? Instead of saying there's a different way for schools to be funded, there's a different way to move money through the system and to the student to make kids perform better and schools perform better. They start off the same premise of the schools need more money. We need to see where the money needs to go. And it's through the legislature, and it's through the courts, and it's through all these different things. And it makes for bad policy.
Yeah, and here's the thing. As usual, we're not the first ones to come up with this idea or adopt it. So has anybody picked up their head to look around the country and see, well, has anybody else tried this? And how have they done? It turns out they have. In Ohio and North Dakota and Arkansas, Wyoming, all evidence-based school funding models in place, some for nearly a decade, billions of additional dollars on K through 12 education, and student achievement on NAEP tests has failed to grow at the rate that evidence-based model funding promised. Achievement has basically been flat.
That's because the money is going to salaries and pensions and structural costs. And the idea that just pouring more money into a system gives better outcomes is a fallacy. It's a fallacy.
So there's research on this. People have looked at this in academia and elsewhere, and we're pleased to have one of those people. He is a Hoover Institute fellow and a Stanford University professor, Eric Hanushek. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an interesting time in Illinois these days.
It's always interesting here, and usually that has a negative connotation associated with the term interesting. The evidence-based funding model that both parties here have accepted, and I referenced some of the results that have been not achieved in other states that have tried this. What's the problem with the premise of the model, if there is one?
Well, the evidence-based model is really a way of getting to an arbitrary number that you can put up, and it sounds good. It sounds good to use evidence to make these decisions, but there's nothing in the funding formula that insists or encourages districts to even follow the programs that lead up to the expenses in the evidence-based model. So this is just a way of deciding how much money should be doled out, but it's not a way of deciding how to run schools or how to get more achievement out of the kids.
So here's some new money associated with these best practices that we encourage you to adopt. And then, if you don't adopt them, then you don't, but you still get the money.
Precisely. And as I look at the situation in Illinois, Illinois' problem is one of school performance, not of lack of money. Illinois is in the top quarter of states in terms of how much they spend per pupil, and it's right around the middle in terms of performance of students.
Professor, I think one of the issues, and I'd love to get your opinion on it, is that parents, who are so obviously integral to the entire idea of how you get these things passed because they have fears about their kids' education and what's going to happen if money doesn't come, how do you get parents and the people in the system to understand that just pouring more money into it doesn't receive actual educational results? Because I think parents actually satiate themselves by saying, well, my kid is going to a school that's spending a lot of money, therefore I'm getting a really good education, when that, in fact, isn't necessarily true.
Well, this is an uphill struggle because parents who have kids in the school today are focused on let's do everything we possibly can to make sure that my kid gets a high-quality education. And if a little money is wasted, it doesn't really matter to them. They're trying to just get the best they can. And it's a matter of getting better information about which schools are, in fact, using the money well and which aren't. It's transparent accountability systems that give direct information on what in academia we would call the value added of schools. What are schools adding to what the kids bring to school with them?
Speaking of picking our head up and looking around to see what other states, localities are doing and maybe try to replicate other people's successes and avoid their failures, much less perpetuating our own, are there examples of school funding that have those accountability mechanisms you're describing that are being practiced in other states successfully that people should be looking at instead of this evidence-based model?
There are. I mean, the best example is actually a funny one. That's Washington, D.C., where Washington, D.C. has focused on what's really important, and that is the quality of instruction and the quality of the teachers. And they have put in place a funding model that is designed to reward teachers that do well to keep them in the classroom, and it's also a funding mechanism that doesn't reward bad performance. In fact, they tend to fire teachers that over a period of time show that they're completely ineffective.
Go figure, Professor, that sort of market-based reward system based on your effort, your ability, your performance would actually work in having better outcomes, given that it works in the private sector and private markets over and over again on a whole bunch of applications. Obviously, that's a great example. The problem we have here, and I'm sure many states do, is that the public sector teacher unions, particularly CPS, Chicago Public Schools, which is notorious, don't allow for those types of programs to be put in place where you'd evaluate teachers based on their success rate. Instead, it's just, lane changes, everybody gets paid a bunch of money, everybody gets big pensions, you can't fire anybody.
Well, you're absolutely correct, and that's a problem across the country. It's perhaps one of the reasons why the U.S. is lagging in terms of performance compared to other international competitors. Our schools are not up to par of many others in the world, in part because we will let poor teachers stay in the classroom for a long period of time.
One of the things that Senate Republicans here in Illinois argued in defending the evidence-based model is that, and I'm quoting from their treatise on the topic, the model looks at the demographics of a school district and calculates how much it would cost to provide teachers for full-day kindergarten, smaller class sizes, specialist teachers, instructional facilitators, intervention teachers, substitute teachers, guidance counselors and nurses, librarians, principals and assistant principals, school site staff, and supervisory aides. Is there any academic peer-reviewed rigor attached to these sorts of calculations in terms of cost?
None. unfortunately, this model has been taken around the country, and it promises huge gains. Essentially, every kid in Illinois could surpass Einstein if you got the gains they promised. But it doesn't happen. I mean, Wyoming is, of course, the best poster child, because Wyoming, in the old days when oil prices were high, didn't really care how much they spent on their schools, and they ran up the price tag a lot, but they didn't get the achievement out of it. And nobody really paid that much attention to it. But we have this problem everywhere where we're not linking payments to the performance of schools.
He is Hoover Institute Fellow and Stanford University Professor Eric Hanushek. He actually wrote a piece about this a decade ago, a piece about evidence-based funding. It's just gotten its way around to Illinois, called The Confidence Men, that you can check out as well. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me.